They didn't come with weapons. They didn't show up at my door with raised voices and pointed fingers. They were quiet about it. Surgical. The kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself until you're already bleeding out on the floor, and even then, even in that moment, you look around and think, how did I not see this coming? I was 41 years old when I realized that the people I had loved most in this world had decided somewhere along the way that loving me back was too expensive. Let me tell you how it started. Not with the ending, because the ending, you'll understand by the time we're done, was years in the making. Every smile I missed. Every thank you that never came. Every time I told myself it was fine, that family is complicated, that sacrifice is what love looks like. I told myself all of it. I told myself so many lies on their behalf that I eventually started believing them. I convinced myself that the silence was just the way things were. That the absence of recognition was normal. That I was being sensitive every time I felt something hollow where gratitude should have been. I talked myself out of my own perception again and again for years, because it was easier than confronting the alternative. That the people I was giving everything to were simply not giving anything back. But the truth has a way of surfacing. And when it finally did, it nearly took me under. My name is Doreen. And for 15 years I was the foundation this family stood on. I just didn't know foundations weren't supposed to have feelings. It started when my mother-in-law, Gloria, had her first stroke. My husband Raymond and I had been married 6 years by then, living comfortably in a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs outside Columbus, Ohio. We had a good life. Not extravagant but steady. Raymond worked in logistics management, a senior coordinator position that paid well and came with benefits and the kind of modest prestige that made him feel solid in himself. I was a licensed occupational therapist, building a private practice from the ground up. I had 12 clients, a small rented office space I shared with a physical therapist named Gail, and a plan that I could see clearly when I let myself look at it. More referrals, a larger space, eventually 2 or 3 associates working under my license. We were moving forward, the way young couples do when they believe in each other and can see the road ahead. Then Gloria had her stroke and the road shifted. Raymond was an only child. His father had passed when Raymond was 17. A construction accident that had left Gloria widowed at 40 and had defined Raymond's sense of himself as a provider and protector in ways I hadn't fully understood until much later. With no sibling to split the responsibility with, no other family nearby to help carry the weight, there was just Raymond and by extension me. I remember the night we sat at the kitchen table and talked about what to do. Raymond was quiet in the way he always got when he was overwhelmed, hands folded on the table, jaw set, eyes somewhere far away. She can't live alone anymore, he said. I know, I said. I said it without thinking. Without calculating what it would cost me specifically. Without asking the questions I should have asked. Who will manage her care day to day? What does that change about my schedule, my practice, my capacity? What happens if her condition worsens? I just said it because it was true and because I loved my husband, and because Gloria had always been warm to me in the early years. The kind of mother-in-law who called me daughter before she had any real reason to, who kept a photo of our wedding on her refrigerator, who asked after my clients by name when I mentioned them. So we moved her in. I want to be honest about the fact that I made that decision freely. No one forced me. But I also want to be honest about the conditions under which that decision was made. Sleep deprived from a demanding client week, emotionally flooded by the fear of watching someone we loved diminished, and operating inside a marriage where the unspoken expectation was already well established. When hard things happen, Doreen handles them. The first year was hard but manageable. Gloria needed help with her left side, weakness from the stroke that affected her arm and her leg. She could walk with a cane, but she tired easily, and her coordination made certain tasks dangerous for her to attempt alone. I modified her daily routine using everything I knew from my practice. I built her a structured schedule for physical movement, gentle exercises, timed walks through the house, progressive challenges designed to preserve her remaining function. I adapted the bathroom, grab bars, a shower seat, a mat with suction cups, a handheld shower head. I set up a medication organizer and a daily log so we could track her blood pressure, her sleep, her appetite. I drove her to appointments twice a week. Her neurologist, her primary care physician, eventually a physical therapist she liked named Frank who had a warmth that made her laugh. I did all of this on top of a full client workload. On top of maintaining a marriage. On top of being a person with my own life, my own exhaustion, my own interests that were slowly receding to the back of a shelf I never seemed to have time to reach. Raymond helped when he could. He genuinely tried in the early days. He would come home and sit with his mother in the evenings, watch the news with her, let her talk about people and places and events from decades ago. There was a real tenderness between them that I found genuinely moving even then. But his work required travel, and the travel became more frequent as his seniority grew, and gradually, naturally, almost invisibly, the weight of Gloria's daily care settled entirely on my shoulders. I didn't make a speech about it. I didn't keep a tally out loud. I just absorbed it the way I had been taught, by my own mother, by the women in my family who taught me, through observation rather than instruction, that the way you proved you loved people was by asking for nothing in return. That need was weakness. That self-sufficiency was grace. Within 2 years, Gloria had recovered enough that she could move around the house independently, manage her own hygiene most days with minimal assistance, and hold steady conversations. But her balance remained compromised, her stamina limited, and her cognitive clarity had noticeably dimmed in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss but persistent enough to worry. He could not live alone. We stayed in our arrangement. I reorganized my practice to take on fewer clients so I could be home more. That cost us real money, not a dramatic headline figure but a steady, cumulative loss over time like water wearing through stone. Hundreds of dollars a month in reduced billing. Thousands over the course of a year. A trajectory for my practice that had been climbing quietly leveled. Raymond noticed. He didn't say thank you. He said, "Can you pick it back up once Mom stabilizes more?" I said yes. Then came Raymond's younger cousin Marcus. Marcus was 23, just back from a stint working on oil platforms off the coast of Louisiana. A rough life, decent money for a young man with no degree, but he'd gotten hurt on the job. A shoulder injury from a piece of equipment that malfunctioned during a storm. His rotator cuff needed surgery and months of recovery. He had no savings worth mentioning. The money had gone to rent, to a truck, to a lifestyle that burned fast at that age. He had no immediate family in Columbus, no girlfriend, no backup plan. Raymond called me from a work trip to Dallas. He said, "Babe, I need to ask you something." And then he paused, the way he did when he already knew he was asking for too much and was hoping his tone would soften the request. By that point I already knew the shape of what was coming. I could feel it in my chest before he even finished the sentence. That familiar compression like the walls of a room slowly moving inward. I knew the answer I was going to give even as I was hearing the question, because the architecture of our life together had already established that this was how things went. Family needed something. I provided it. Marcus moved into our guest room 2 weeks later. I want to be careful here because Marcus was not a bad person. He was young and he was hurting and he was lost, the way men that age can be lost when the life they expected doesn't pan out and there's no map for what comes next. I understood that. I made an effort with him, cooked extra at dinners, asked about his recovery, introduced him to Frank, the physical therapist who had helped Gloria, who agreed to work with Marcus at a reduced rate as a favor to me. But I was now cooking for 4 people. Managing Gloria's care, supporting Marcus's recovery, running my practice and holding my marriage together, all simultaneously, while Raymond traveled for work more than ever because the promotion he'd been offered required it, and we needed the income and I was the one at home, so of course I was the one who stayed. I stayed. Always stayed. Marcus lived with us for 11 months. During that time, thanks in part to the recovery work Frank did with him, he regained enough function in his shoulder to take a job at an auto shop. Lighter work than the platforms, steadier hours. He saved enough to put a deposit on a small apartment. When he finally moved out, he shook Raymond's hand warmly, hugged Gloria, and then looked at me and said, with a smile that was genuine enough and insufficient in a way he probably didn't even recognize, "Thanks for everything, D." Just like that. "Thanks for everything, D." The same thing you'd say to someone who'd held the door open for you. I watched him carry boxes to his truck. I stood in the doorway with a dish towel over my shoulder. I had been in the middle of something, I always was, and I thought, 11 months. I gave 11 months of my life to that young man and he doesn't even fully know what it cost. And then I went back inside. And I started dinner. I don't know exactly when the dynamic changed with Gloria. I have tried many times in the years since to trace it back to a specific moment. A specific comment, a specific afternoon when the warmth went out of her eyes when she looked at me. I can't find it. It happened the way fog rolls in, gradually and then all at once. By the time Gloria had lived with us for 5 years, she had gotten comfortable in a way that had edges to it. She started making comments about my cooking. Small jabs delivered with a smile, the kind of passive aggression that is engineered to be deniable. Raymond never liked dishes this spicy, she'd say about food that wasn't spicy at all. Or she'd offer unsolicited observations. The house felt different when he was young. More relaxed. She'd ask questions with a particular inflection. Are you working less now? You seem less busy. When I explained what I was actually doing, she'd nod slowly, in a way that communicated nothing so much as disbelief. She started calling Raymond on her cell phone when he was home. Calling him from the next room to ask for things she could have asked me. Setting up a channel of communication that bypassed me deliberately, or so it felt. I brought it up to Raymond once. I said carefully that his mother's comments were sometimes unkind, and that I was starting to feel like my contributions to the household went unacknowledged. Not just by Gloria but generally. That I needed us to acknowledge together what I was carrying and what it cost. Raymond sighed. He set down his fork. He said, "She's old, Doreen. She's had a hard life." That was the first time I understood clearly that my feelings were going to be ranked below the feelings of everyone else in that house. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a quiet, firm signal delivered without apparent cruelty. Your discomfort is a smaller thing than their comfort. Adjust accordingly. I adjusted. I became quieter about the things that bothered me. I stopped raising concerns about Gloria's comments because the one time I was made to feel that the comments were somehow my fault. The result of my own sensitivity, my own failure to understand what an elderly woman had been through. I rerouted my frustration internally. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was strong enough to absorb it. I was strong enough. But strength that is never replenished doesn't last forever. The invitation to the family reunion in Georgia, Raymond's extended family, his aunts and cousins and second cousins once removed, a network that gathered every 2 years at a rented property outside Macon, came in the summer of our 9th year of marriage. I had been to 2 of them before. I knew what they were. Loud, joyful, exhausting in the way large family gatherings always are, full of people who would embrace you and overlook you in the same breath, who would ask about your work and forget your answer before you finished giving it. I almost didn't go that year. I was stretched thin. A client load I'd been trying to rebuild, Gloria who had developed new complications with her blood pressure, and a bone-deep fatigue that had been sitting in me for so long I'd stopped noticing it as anything unusual. It was just my baseline now. The steady hum of depletion. But Raymond asked me to come. He said it would be good for us. Time together, away from the house, away from the daily weight of everything. He was tender about it in a way that still worked on me then, and I believed him. I went. What I didn't know was that Raymond had been having a private conversation with several of his aunts about me for months. I found out 2 years later from a cousin named Jada who felt guilty enough about what she knew to finally tell me over a phone call that lasted 2 hours and left me sitting on my kitchen floor for a long time afterward. At that reunion, Raymond had been quietly building a case. Telling his family that the marriage was difficult. That I was controlling. That I had isolated him from his roots. That I managed the household finances too tightly and kept him on a short leash. That the house had become oppressive since his mother moved in. None of it was true. The finances were managed tightly because we had taken on significant costs with Gloria's care and the period with Marcus and then the property he would ask me about a year later. I had never prevented Raymond from seeing his family. He traveled constantly and had more freedom of movement than I had seen in years. I had driven his mother to every medical appointment she had in this city for going on a decade. But his family believed him. Of course they did. Because he was one of them, blood, history, a name they recognized. And I was just the woman he'd married. The outsider who had somehow ended up at the center of everything while remaining, in their eyes, peripheral. The money conversation happened in our 10th year. Raymond came to me with a proposal. His aunt Bernice, 72, recently diagnosed with early-stage dementia, needed more support than she was getting in her home in Atlanta. She had a modest house, paid off, and a small fixed income from Social Security and a cafeteria worker's pension. She was a gentle woman. I had no ill feeling toward her whatsoever. Raymond's proposal was layered. He wanted us to purchase a small investment property in Columbus. A duplex or a 2-bedroom affordable that we would rent out. The rental income would help offset Bernice's care costs while she remained in Atlanta. Eventually, he said, when Bernice could no longer live independently, she would come to Columbus. And eventually the property would be an asset for both of us. I had concerns. Specific, concrete financial concerns I laid out as fairly as I could. We had been carrying elevated household costs for years. My practice had never fully recovered the volume I'd given up. We had no meaningful emergency fund. Taking on a second mortgage felt like a risk we were not positioned to absorb if something went wrong. I put a spreadsheet on the kitchen table and walked Raymond through our actual monthly outflows versus income. I showed him the gap. I showed him that a 4-month vacancy on a second property, not an unlikely scenario, would put us in genuine difficulty. He listened. He thanked me for running the numbers. He said we'd think about it. What he did 3 days later was go to Gloria. He sat with his mother and presented my concerns not as financial caution but as my unwillingness to prioritize family. Gloria told him I was putting money above people who needed help. She told him a good wife trusted her husband's judgment. She told him, and this is the part that still sits in me with a particular weight, that she had never fully believed I understood what family meant. This from a woman I had bathed. A woman I had driven to 37 medical appointments in the previous year alone. I counted. I kept the records because my practice had trained me to keep records, and that habit at least served me when it mattered most. Raymond came back to me and said he was moving forward with the property. He had found a duplex he liked. He had already spoken to a mortgage broker. I was not consulted further. For the next 2 years, the rental property was a persistent, grinding source of financial stress. The first tenants, a couple Raymond had approved without running the background check I had asked him to run, left without notice 8 months in, 2 months behind on rent and with a bathroom that needed significant repairs. There was a vacancy of 4 months during which we covered the mortgage on 2 properties from 1 salary and 1 significantly reduced practice income. I did not say I told you so. Not once. I simply managed the situation, coordinated the repairs, found a property manager we could afford, placed better tenants, stabilized the income. I did what I always did. I kept it from falling apart. Bernice's condition progressed faster than anyone anticipated. By the end of that second year, she was wandering at night and had twice been found by neighbors outside her home in the early morning hours. Raymond's aunts in Georgia were dealing with their own health issues. His cousins had young children and jobs they couldn't abandon. There was, in that family, a talent for identifying the person most capable of handling a difficult thing and then simply not doing the thing themselves until that person stepped forward. I was always the one who stepped forward. I remember the night Raymond told me Bernice would need to come to Columbus. I had just finished settling Gloria for the night. Her blood pressure check, her nighttime medications, a brief conversation about something she'd seen on television that she'd already half forgotten by the time I turned out her light. I came downstairs and Raymond was waiting for me with the careful posture of someone who knows they are about to ask for more than they have a right to ask for. He told me about Bernice's situation. He said he knew it was a lot. I looked at my husband and I felt something inside me give way. Not with noise. Not with tears. It was quieter than that. Like a hinge going slack or a thread at the end of its stretch. I said, Raymond, I need us to talk about what this is doing to me. He said, I know it's a lot. I know it is. But there's nobody else. There's me, I said. There's always me. And nobody ever asks if there's enough of me left. He looked at me with something complicated moving behind his eyes. Guilt maybe, or the early architecture of a decision he'd already made, and he said, we'll get through this. I'll help more. He didn't help more. He traveled more, as if the announcement of his intention to be present functioned as a substitute for the presence itself. Bernice moved in the following spring. She was sweet in the way certain people with dementia are, caught in an earlier, gentler version of themselves. He sometimes thought I was a neighbor. Sometimes she thought I was a nurse. Occasionally she would look at me with sudden, startling clarity and say something kind and specific. You look tired, baby. You should rest. And those moments were almost harder to take than the confusion because they were so accurate and so brief. I learned what the dementia literature called sundowning firsthand. The agitation that increased in the late afternoons, the way the familiar would become frightening without warning. I learned which diversions worked for Bernice and which didn't. I learned the rhythm of her confusion the way you learn to read weather. Not perfectly but well enough to prepare. I was now providing personal care to one woman and memory care support to another. I was managing a household, a rental property and a private practice. I had not taken a vacation in 6 years. My friendships had contracted to a few texts and 4 lunches a year. I had a therapist I saw every 3 weeks when I could make the time, and she had been saying, carefully and persistently for 2 years, that I was running a deficit that would not sustain indefinitely. I began to notice, around this time, a shift in the way I was being spoken about within Raymond's family. Not something I could point to directly, no single incident. Just a pattern I was assembling in pieces, the way you assemble a picture you don't want to see. Marcus let something slip during a visit when he'd had a few drinks. He mentioned that the family thought I ran a tight ship. Said it with a smirk, in the tone of a man softening a harsher version of the phrase. I asked him what he meant. He backtracked, said nothing, changed the subject. I thought about what Jada would eventually tell me, that Raymond had been building a case at that Georgia reunion years before this, and that the case had been growing ever since. That there was a version of me circulating in that family that I didn't recognize. Controlling, cold, financially miserly, inhospitable. The same woman who had taken in 2 family members and managed their care for years, rendered in this other narrative as the obstacle. The gatekeeper. The one who made things difficult. It was a work of quiet, sustained revision. And I had been too busy keeping the household running to notice it happening. The confrontation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in February, the kind of gray midwinter afternoon that already feels defeated by noon. Raymond had called his aunts and cousins to the house. 4 of them, all women, all from his side of the family. I came downstairs from helping Gloria with her afternoon routine. Blood pressure, medications, the brief walk around the living room her physical therapist had prescribed, and found them seated in my living room. My living room. Waiting for me. Raymond was standing near the fireplace with his arms loosely crossed. He didn't look at me when I came in. Vernice, one of his aunts, a woman I had cooked 3 full Thanksgiving dinners for, who had eaten at my table and kissed my cheek when she left, leaned forward in her chair with the practiced solemnity of someone who has rehearsed this moment and said, "Doreen, we're here because we're worried about Raymond. We feel like this marriage has become unhealthy, and we think it's time for a real conversation." I stood in my own living room in the house I had managed and maintained and bent my life around for years, and I understood immediately what this was. This was an intervention. And I was not the person being saved. I was the thing being intervened against. They spoke for nearly an hour. They said I was controlling. They said I had isolated Raymond from the people who loved him. They said the house felt like a hospital, an observation that might have been accurate given that it had functioned as something close to a care facility for a decade, but which was presented not as a fact about the circumstances but as a reflection of my character. They said Raymond was unhappy. They said he deserved better. Raymond said nothing. He stood near the fireplace and looked at the floor. At one point Vernice said, "You've never made him feel like family comes first." I let that sit for a moment. Long enough that the room got quiet in a slightly different way, a way that registered that I was not going to nod and apologize. Then I looked at Gloria, seated in the armchair in the corner. The armchair I had selected because the arm height and seat height were both correct for her hip, and I said, "Gloria has lived in this home for 10 years. I have managed her care for 10 years. I have bathed her, dressed her, driven her to every medical appointment she has had in this city, restructured my professional life to be available to her, and organized a household around her needs every single day. Bernice has lived here for the past year and I have managed her care as well. Before that, Marcus lived here for 11 months while he recovered from surgery, and I coordinated his physical therapy and put food on his table every night. I have done all of this without complaint, without compensation, without a single person in this room ever asking whether I needed anything. So I would like someone to explain to me specifically what putting family first would have looked like that I did not do." Silence. I looked at Raymond. "You asked me to take care of your family," I said. "I did that. Every single day for 10 years I did that. And now you have brought these women into our home to tell me I did it wrong." He finally looked at me. And what I saw on his face was not guilt. It was not love or sorrow or anger. It was relief. The specific relief of a man who has made a decision he couldn't justify honestly and has found a way to make it someone else's fault. Raymond filed for divorce 4 months later. I won't tell you the devastation was simple. It wasn't the kind that comes all at once and names itself clearly. It was the kind that works slowly. A settling, a warping, a structural change that takes time to understand. I had built my understanding of love on the idea that if you gave enough, if you showed up consistently, if you proved through action that you were committed, then the foundation would hold. That belief was wrong. Not because sacrifice is meaningless. Because sacrifice without equity is not love. It is labor. I had been doing labor for years and calling it love, and in that confusion I had given away things I could not get back. The divorce proceedings revealed things I had not known. Raymond had consulted an attorney 8 months before the intervention in the living room. The rental property, the one I had opposed and then managed and then stabilized through its most difficult period, had been retitled into his name alone during a refinancing 2 years prior. I had signed the documents. I had been exhausted. I had trusted him. And I had not read carefully enough. I hired my own attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had the manner of someone who had seen every variation of this story and was neither surprised nor defeated by any of them. She reviewed our financial history, the household records I had kept, meticulous because 15 years of managing complex care schedules had made me that way, and she said, "You have a strong case. We will argue contribution to household assets and documented impairment of earning capacity." We argued about it. The proceedings were not pleasant. Raymond's family offered testimony about my character. I offered documentation. Documentation, it turns out, is more durable than testimony. Gloria passed away 8 months after the filing. A second stroke larger than the first, and she was gone within 3 days. I was not included in the arrangements. 10 years of care, and I was handled like a stranger at the end. Not with cruelty but with the particular erasure of being made invisible by people who no longer needed you. I went to the funeral. I sat in the back of the church in a dark dress, and I did not speak to anyone from Raymond's family, and I watched them grieve together, and I felt the precise texture of being on the outside of something you helped build. I cried in my car afterward. I cried for Gloria, who had not always been kind to me but who had called me daughter before she had reason to. I cried for the version of myself who had walked into that marriage full of something I would have called hope, who had believed without question that showing up for people meant they would show up for you. That love was a ledger that balanced. It doesn't always balance. I know that now. The divorce was finalized 13 months after it was filed. I received a settlement that Patricia called fair. Not generous. Fair. There is a difference, and I have sat with that difference, and I am grateful for fair because I understand how easily it could have been nothing. Bernice was moved to a memory care facility within 6 months of our separation. Once Raymond's family discovered that managing her care themselves was not the simple matter they had imagined when they were cataloging my failures. She passed away the following year. I was not notified. I found out through a former client who had known the family. Marcus sent me a message through social media. He said he was sorry about how things went. He said I deserved better. I read the message 3 or 4 times. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could fit inside a reply box that would have been both true and useful. I am 44 now and I am rebuilding. My client load is full. I am working toward bringing on an associate, something I had planned at 35 before the plans were rerouted. I have an apartment that is entirely mine, and the quiet of it still surprises me in small recurring ways. Not dramatic relief but the small surprise of someone who had forgotten what her own silence sounded like. I sleep through the night. I cook what I want to eat. I have lunch with my friends more than 4 times a year, and those lunches feel like they are mine now, not like visits to a foreign country. My therapist at our last session used the phrase restored sense of agency. I would describe it differently. I have learned at significant cost that my life is mine. I want to be honest about what I still carry. The grief is not gone. There are mornings when I wake and for a few seconds I am back in that house, moving through the practiced routines of someone who gave their life to a household that didn't protect them in return, and the weight of those years sits in my chest with a specific gravity. I am not healed in any neat, tidy way. I am changed, which is different, and in the change I am finding things that are worth having. There are things I have learned that I want to say plainly. Generosity is only a virtue when it is sustainable. When generosity becomes a way of disappearing, when you give not from abundance but from the habit of never saying no, from the fear that saying no makes you unlovable, from the belief that your worth is measured by your usefulness, it stops being generosity. It becomes self-erasure. And self-erasure is not noble. It is just damage done quietly over a long time to yourself. Certain families are organized around a person who absorbs, who fills the gaps, who asks nothing and therefore receives nothing, and whose labor is invisible because to see it would require gratitude, and gratitude would require admission, and admission would require acknowledging the debt. The people who benefit most from your sacrifice are often the last people who will thank you for it. Because thanking you would mean acknowledging what they took. And some people would rather rewrite the story than carry the debt. The people most likely to call you selfish are often the people who spent years consuming your selflessness. The moment you ask for recognition, for equity, for rest, for the basic acknowledgement that you are a person and not a resource, you become the difficult one. The one who changed. The one with the problem. You didn't change. You got tired of disappearing. Those are different things, and the people who confuse them are usually the ones who needed you to stay invisible. I want to say one more thing because it is the truest thing I know from all of this. I do not regret caring for Gloria. I don't. I regret the structure around it. The assumption that it was mine to carry without discussion, the silence where gratitude should have been, the way my labor was rendered not just invisible but ultimately inverted and used as evidence against me. But Gloria herself, the woman in the armchair with her hip that needed a certain height and her memories of a life I never knew, I do not regret her. She deserved to be cared for with dignity in her final years. She was. I did that. I just wish the people who loved her had loved me even a fraction as much in return. That is the truest thing I can tell you about all of it. Not that I was perfect, I wasn't. Not that I never made mistakes or missed signals or should have spoken up sooner, harder, differently. I should have. But underneath all the legal documents and the inheritance of silence and the intervention staged in my own living room, at the absolute core of this story, is something very simple. I gave everything I had for years, to people who never once stopped to ask if I was okay. And the day I finally asked that question for myself, the day I stood in my kitchen and said there isn't enough of me left, they called it a problem. They made it mine to solve. And I decided that it wasn't. I decided I was allowed to take my life back. Not perfectly, not without grief, not without the long and uneven work of becoming myself again after years of making myself smaller. But I was allowed. And I did. If you've ever poured yourself into people who made you feel like the pouring was never enough, this one was for you.